morning before your harvest. As you can see, Randy, thank you there for recording the meeting. This will be recorded and you can find it on ForGround.com in your ForGround portal after the meeting here in your benefits section. Really appreciate you all joining us today. As you are aware, it is 9/11 today, so as we move throughout our day, always good to be thinking about more than 7,000 troops we've lost in the war since that day, and pay our respects. So again, thanks for joining us. We have with us today our partners here at BAM-WX Weather for giving us a harvest weather outlook. We've got our internal team of sustainable systems agronomists joining us as well today to give us a little bit of insight around what things should we consider if we're going to be planting a cover crop with the given outlook on weather here coming up in the next couple months. Zach Larson, Tyler Williams, Austin Omer, and Seth Spire, thanks for joining us today. On the BAM-WX side, we have Brett Waltz, Matt Griffin, and Will Danby here joining us. So we'll kick us off here with the harvest weather outlook. From there, Tyler and Zach will give us a little bit of insight around how our regenerative practices might tie in and some things we might lend consideration to. We do have the ability for some question and answer here. So if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate. Just pop those into the Q&A chat here at the bottom of your screen. You should see several options right at the bottom of the presentation, and that little the Q&A blurb there will allow you to enter a question. Once we get here to the end of the presentation, be happy to get all those answered for you in front of our host and our panelists here. So really appreciate y'all joining us today. I know things are about to get extremely busy for y'all, but I hope you find this session informative. This is one of many benefits we like to offer through our ForGround by Bayer platform. Access to agronomic support tools like this weather outlook webinar itself, access to cost reduction measures like discounts, rebates, and other things that might help you in your adoption of regenerative practices. And then last but not least, access to various carbon programs with different eligibility. So depending on where you're at, we'll have many additional revenue opportunities for you that are hosted in ForGround. So again, we'll have several of these weather outlook webinars, really looking to do them at timely places within the season. So we've got our harvest weather outlook. We'll have another one here this winter when we get an idea of how things are shaping up. Going to be a cold year, going to be a warm winter with not a lot of disease or insect kill, but we'll find out here, all thanks to our team at BAM-WX keeping us all in the loop. So really appreciate y'all taking the time to join us today. Will, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thank you. Can you guys hear me all right?
Loud and clear, Will.
All right, I'll go ahead here and get screen sharing going. Okay, can everyone see that all right there? All righty, let's go ahead and get started here. And I want to say thank you here, Matthew and Tyler, for having me on here and being able to share some of our forecast thoughts rolling forward here. All right, so let's start off here, guys, with the current drought conditions. These are updated this past weekend at September 5th. And what we can notice here first and foremost is just how dry it's been across a lot of our growing regions, most notably in here through northern Iowa and southern Minnesota. I do think this is going to continue to be an issue for us, at least rolling forward over about the next 2 weeks here. Looking at some of our products for our long range, at least to close out our month, I do see this continuing to be an issue for areas across Iowa, southern Minnesota, and in through Wisconsin. Even areas of northern Illinois and northwestern Illinois have been very dry over the past 2 weeks. And in terms of our degradation here, we can see it's continued to further dry out. The soils deteriorate here across northern Iowa and through southern Minnesota as well. And we can see that starting to creep further east towards the Ohio Valley because it's been very dry across Indiana and through northwestern Ohio as well. So I do think for the short term that we are going to have to be watching in through these areas here. I'm going to try to carefully circle this in here. I think we can continue to see this to be a problem. Now, fortunately, we are getting some rainfall that's really desperately needed for today. But in terms of where we go from the next 2 weeks from now, I think these spots are really keen, are going to be really keen on just being dry, which is going to be, again, problematic for us. Let me bear with me here. I'm trying to get through some of these slides. I'm new to the whole process here of coloring and shading and drawing some areas, but our current soil moisture here as of September 8th, again, it's just extremely dry across these areas. I went ahead and I threw in from our historic climate from 1893, the district rankings here across some geographical locations. You can see the spots at 131. These are the driest since record, and this is going back again since 1893. I pulled this starting on August 26th through just this morning, and you can see a heart of our growing spots are dealing with a historical dry stretch that's mainly going to be problematic to see our high-end yields. I don't think that's going to be something that we can see this year, just to how dry it's been, especially since the start of August. It's really dried things out fairly quickly here and continuing to be an issue in that retrospect. But at least where we go from here now, this is taking a look at our forecasts from September 22nd through October 5th. We will start to see the central US get a little bit more active. We're actually starting to see that this week as well, really starting to see some shots of precipitation slide in through these areas, in through here across Nebraska and Kansas. I think these areas here that have also dealt with periods of dryness, especially in through late July, early August, can at least pick up and cash in on some precipitation chances here throughout our weeks 3-4 timeframe. This again takes us into that beginning of October. Now, a lot of our low pressure systems or our storm systems, I think a lot of them are going to track in through these areas and through here and work in across the Ohio Valley. But the concern, I think, with these is a lot of these are pulling in Canadian air, some cooler air up from Canada. There's not a lot of precipitation that's going to be associated with these. So I think the issue is once we start pulling in some of this cooler air, once we work into the kind of that end of September, early October, I still see it being problematic for areas across the Great Lakes to continue to be dry up and through these areas. And in terms of what we're looking like for our tropical activity, this is also going to be a main problem we need to deal with to watch for some drier risks. So you can see our area for storm systems we need to watch out is going to be along the East Coast here. And we're actually seeing right now, we have Hurricane Lee that's positioned somewhat about in through this area here. And throughout this week, it is going to be actually tracking up and off the East Coast here. We don't anticipate a landfall across the mid-Atlantic portions, but I think if we're looking at the coast of Maine and here through Massachusetts, we have to watch out for these areas for a landfall in through here. But the implications that this has for us is it continues to keep the ag belt and lower Ohio Valley at a dry risk. I think areas in through here, it's just going to continue to be a dry risk throughout this week. And then as we get into the kind of that third week of September next week to close out the week, we still need to watch this area along the southeast coast for tropical activity. Now, again, what happens is if we can get a storm that's somewhere in this vicinity and through here, these are just moisture robbers to the areas up and through here. These like to exchange moisture and really just hog it all, which would continue to keep things dry at least over the next 2 weeks for us in terms of our tropical activity. We have upgraded our classification to be more above normal from previously what we'd anticipated. We had more of an average season, but due to how warm the sea surface temperatures are in the Atlantic, not a lot of what's called shear or strong winds in the mid-levels that would help rip hurricanes apart. We're not seeing much of that in throughout the month of September here, so we've since kind of upgraded our classifications for tropical activity. Now, in terms of our seasonal signals, going to start to kind of branch things out and more, get into October and in through November. Our main pattern driver is going to be a strong El Nino for this fall. And we're even potentially going to be flirting with this idea of a super El Nino, which is just extremely above normal temperatures along the equator in the Pacific. We look right off the coast of South America across the Pacific Ocean for these temperatures along the equator. And a lot of the model guidance here, if we can get above 2 degrees Celsius as our average temperature, so 2 degrees warmer, that's starting to get into the category here of that super El Nino. Certainly, if not a super El Nino, we will be dealing with a stronger El Nino in the foreseeable future. You can see as we progress in through October here, November, and in through December, a strong El Nino is in store, and it is going to be here for us throughout the fall and into the winter. And some of our similar years that we've been looking at, a lot of years that come up are 1997 and 2015 for us. I think those are very high for our guidance for some similarities in our pattern as we progress into the fall and early winter months here. Also need to take into account some other years that were similar were 2009, 1991. I think we could also go ahead, throw in the year of 1994 as well, some of these similar years that have done similar pattern progressions in the past. And if we're just looking at our strong El Nino fall temperatures for September, October, and November, these are overall a cool look for us. We stay cool across the Great Lakes region and in throughout the Ohio Valley. Now, I do think it's a risk here that we stay drier across the Ohio Valley. We do see some pockets of wetter or above normal precipitation through the central U.S. Again, these are just taking the years for strong El Ninos. We went ahead and we're going to start to kind of filter out some of the years we think might be better to give us a better look. But generally, the temperatures across much of our growing regions are going to be cooler than normal as we get into October. And I think the beginning of November, I think we can see some active spots of precipitation as we progress into October and in through early November as well. And again, just to provide a visual for us guys as to where we're looking at for this El Nino signal. This is the equator here along the Pacific. You can see we're very interested in this here. This is what's catching our eyes the most with the anomalous warm temperatures. This would be called an eastern based Nino. The entire basin for our Ninos in this blue box here. But the fact that really the eastern part of this box is extremely warm is going to have a lot of implications for how we play out here getting into October and November. And then, as I said here, 2015, 1997, we see these years pop up as our desired years that we're looking at. If we go ahead now, and again, we're starting to funnel some of this in here, we get more of our eastern-based Ninos, kind of filtering out some of those other Nino years to get a more accurate depiction. We can see that the cooler temperatures are more concentrated across the Ohio Valley. I do still think we remain cooler here across the Great Lakes, and some spots to watch out for, I think, into October that can be cooler is across Minneapolis or southern Minnesota and in through Iowa. Precipitation, again, it's a little bit messy here, guys. You can almost see a little bit of an active flow across the Southwest as well as along the East Coast. This is what's going to be called an active or an awakening tropical jet influence. We get our two jets. We have a polar jet in the winter that becomes pronounced as we get into November and October. And we also have another jet that resides further south, which is our tropical jet. And I think we're going to be feeling more of the influences from the tropical jet for precipitation, at least, as we get into the fall months ahead of us. Now, something else that we're also looking at that's taking into account for some of our analog years is it's called the IOD. We're simply just looking at the Indian Ocean. There's a relationship between sea surface temperatures between the western side of the ocean and the eastern side. What we're observing right now is what's going to be called a positive IOD. We have cooler temperatures here across the eastern side of the Indian Ocean, and we have warmer temperatures across the western side. What this allows for us, guys, is it creates a dipole or a relation into the US as well. It's similar to an El Nino. We can use this to get a base of how we see the temperature and precipitation progression occurring. And years similar, again, I want us to note, we can see that 2015 pops up in through here, 97, 94. I think I mentioned that a little bit earlier as well. These are all years, again, that had a similar progression. And when we look at those IODs, we can see that there's actually a little bit of a warmer risk in here across the northern tier of the northern plains once we take September, October, and November. But it's also a very active and wet pattern for us across a lot of the region. Again, this is just looking at strictly the IOD. We're kind of starting to blend some ideas here for what we can look like moving forward. When we combine all those ideas together, this is what our September, October, and November analogs look like. We like the years 91, 2015, 97, and 2009. The ones with the asterisks here are kind of our top 2 years that we're going with. And how I see this progressing, guys, I think we can stay the coolest as we get in through mid-October, I think in these areas and through here. But I think as we start working further in through November, late October, we start to see some warmth or dive down towards the south and the east in here. And I think the further we work into November, we start to see cooler temperatures shift down towards the south, and we start getting in some warmth to talk about across the northern plains. Again, we can see some of this idea of an active jet for our precipitation. We can see flow across the southern third of the United States with our tropical jet. I do think we can see some of this work in through the central US, and it provides some relief for some of our precipitation. But again, as I noted in the beginning of our presentation, I think the concern is that we still do stay pretty dry across much of our growing region. We're going to have to wait till we get into the beginning of October before we really start to see the pattern get a little bit more active for us. Now, in terms of our frost and freeze analogs, here's a look at just our charts for our city names here and our date where we anticipate our first frost and then our first freeze and when it historically happens for us. I went ahead and I boxed in Minneapolis and Bismarck areas here across the northern plains that I think are a little bit of some lower confidence. We're going to be kind of on a cusp or a teeter zone with some storm systems starting to work in that has, again, just some lower confidence here. But when I go ahead here, I'm going to show what this looks like for us. I think the first one we got to watch out for is going to be the 17th and the 19th, that we get these cold fronts or the low pressure systems that will come down through here. Again, not a lot of precipitation is going to be associated with these. These are more so bringing in some cooler than normal air for us. And I think, again, we still got to watch through these areas here for some lower confidence if we can reach that frost threshold of around 36 Fahrenheit, but certainly something to be on the table for. And then as we get into that last and final week of September into October, I think we can get a more potent low pressure system that can bring in some cooler airs, expand it further east here across interior portions of the Northeast. And I still do think I didn't include it on this, but we got to watch kind of these cusp areas. I'm going to go ahead and include Chicago, even Cleveland in through this, as some of our past analog years would also support at least the risk for that in through there going forward. Now, in terms of our monthly outlooks, guys, for September, a lot of this we've already observed. We've seen very warm temperatures across the central US, and I'd even argue up here across the northern plains here across northern Wisconsin and Minnesota. These areas have been very warm to start off September and to close October. I think we can still hang on to very warm temperatures across the central US, and some of our cooler seasonal temperatures would be hugging the coasts here for September. As we get into October, again, a lot of our storm systems are going to, or our fronts are going to track down in through this area and progress through here. And what that does is it's going to be bringing in, more often than not, some cooler temperatures that can work in and leave really the Great Lakes regions, the Ohio Valley, cooler than normal for us. And what happens as we get into November is the best way to imagine this is this coolness starts to shift further south. It starts to work in south, and we start to see some of this warmth work its way over the north and across the top, across the northern third of the United States. A lot of this can be supported too with the active jet across the US will keep things wet for us and cooler in the central third or southern half of the United States. In terms of our precipitation, walking through these things here, guys, I think can see some flow across the northern portions of the United States in through North Dakota and Minnesota. And as we get into October, talking about the jet influence, starting to see this jet come to life and pump up some moisture. What's going to happen is we do have that moisture source. We get some of our low pressure systems to track in through this area. And what that does is that kicks up a lot of active moisture for us across the lower Ohio Valley, the deep south portions of the central United States. Now, the concern here I can see happening, we can get some more of this dryness to shift a little bit further towards the west if some of these lows can be stronger, if they can bring in some cooler air for us. What happens is that it starts cutting off your prospects for precipitation, and you start just getting these deeper, cooler shots with not a lot of precipitation to talk about. And if we look at November, it's a pretty similar look to October, albeit I think we see the pattern shift just a little bit further south and a little bit more east. If we start to retract the coolness towards the south and the southeast, a lot of our patterns going to follow pursuit there, and we start to see this work and shift down towards the south and the south and east. And then overall, guys, going to combine everything we're looking at here. We're looking at the eastern base Ninos, our IOD or Indian Ocean dipole relationships, as well as blending the idea of September, October, November, all in one image. This is kind of our main takeaway fall forecast for us. We can see the Ohio Valley remains below normal for us. Great Lakes areas is going to be seasonable to near average. And I think as we get towards the further north and west we work, the better the opportunity for us to be warmer than normal. Now, I will say, I do think an area that can be at risk of being a little more seasonable, if I can extend this back a little more towards the central US and maybe a little bit further south and in through these areas, I do think that's going to be possible. But the reason we've chosen to keep this as above is just how warm September has been. It's really going to be a matter of can October and can November kind of outweigh the record warmth here across the central US. So I think that's something to keep in mind for us here rolling forward. And then for our precipitation, again, you can see we got a very active subtropical jet in through this area. I think the risk for this could be, again, if this can move a little bit further towards the west, maybe we have some of our low pressure systems tracking or diving a little bit more this way, then this can be a little bit drier across the central US overall as a whole once we balance out our 3 months through here. Now, in terms of our soil moisture forecast, guys, this is also looking at an overall picture from September, October, and in through November. I went ahead, I shaded areas in green where I think we can see improvement, especially into mid-October, late October, early November. I think we can get some precipitation starting to work in through these areas that are so gosh darn dry right now, start to work in some more moisture. The areas, again, outlined in green here are seeing improvements. I think the areas that are at risk that we need to watch for soil to get drier is going to be across the northern plains. Certainly think we can get some flow in the short term here, but I think as we start working into mid to late October, into early November, we start bringing in some of this warmth. We showed on some of those analogs there, some of the warmth starting to come in across these areas here. I think this can be a risk that has dry weather coupled with it as well. So again, the main takeaway out of this image is as we look at between now and the end of November, overall going to be seeing improvements in through these areas across the Ag Belt, northern portions of the Ohio Valley, and then across the deep south and the south central. I think we can see an improvement with just how active our tropical jet is going to be rolling forward. And real quick, guys, I want to go ahead and I'll give us a quick winter sneak peek. I don't want to spend too much time on this. But again, we're looking at our strong El Nino winters, and it is a warm forecast for a lot of our growing regions. going to be a warmer and milder forecast for us. So we can see some cooler temperatures will be residing here across the southwestern portions of the United States. Here's a look at our height anomalies. This is just simply looking at if we were to go into the middle level of the atmosphere and see where temperatures are warmer or cooler than normal. We can see a lot of this warmth is hugging the northern third of the United States, and it resonates very similar here with our top analog plots for strong El Nino winters. If we take a look at that same idea with the IOD as well for December, it looks very similar to just the El Nino pattern for our strong Ninos. We have this idea of warmth across the Ohio Valley, the Ag Belt, the Northern Plains, trying to hold on to some cooler temperatures here across the Southwest United States. But I think what's going to be interesting is into February, we need to watch for the opportunity for some cooler temperatures to work in towards the tail end of winter. I do think December, January are going to be very warm months. The risk is as we get in through February and even into March, that we start working in some cooler temperatures finally, as there is some support from that for some stronger IOD years. I also think we need to watch, again, we can get some stronger storm systems to track in through these areas. I think if we're in areas along the mid-Atlantic, the lower Ohio Valley, this setup to me does look like it could be possible for a larger winter storm getting in towards that mid-February timeframe. So something just to watch, guys. And that's kind of our initial thinking right now as we start off the winter, December, January, a lot warmer and drier, but as we get towards February and into the later part of that month, that we can see the opportunity maybe for a glimpse of an actual winter with some storm systems trying to work in through the area. Again, here's how it looks once we kind of blend all these ideas together. I don't want to kind of nail this into the ground over and over again, but just discuss with it here as we can see it, that warmth starts to work in across December, January. And I need to watch into February the opportunity to get a little bit cooler across the Ohio Valley with some of these storm systems working through the area. We can see the south or the southern portions of the U.S. across Texas, the Gulf of Mexico, coastal regions here across the U.S. are going to be our active spots. But a lot of the Nino outlooks, guys, are warm and dry risks getting into December and in through January. So I kind of to just recap real quickly, guys, I want to just state, I think for a lot of us across the Ag Belt, the Ohio Valley, the Northern Plains, we're going to start off pretty dry over about the next 2 to 3 weeks here. I think that as we work further into October, the pattern can get more active, more wet for us. It can linger in through early November. But I think as we start to get deeper into November, we start to see that warmth creep in from the northwest. We start to dry out more. We start to work into our winter months here that are going to be warmer and drier risks across those regions rolling forward. That's all I have for us right here on our webinar. Go ahead and I'll throw things over here to Tyler.
Yeah, thanks, Will. I appreciate that, and I'll go ahead and jump in here. Just some things from the agronomic perspective. So for those, I'm Tyler Williams. I'm a sustainable systems agronomist here in. I'm located in Lincoln, Nebraska. I'm part of the ForGround team here within Bayer. I've been doing this for about a year and a half or so, and really just wanted to bring in myself and as well as a number of other agronomists that are with us on the call, just to try to answer questions around, how does this impact your farm? We're working specifically with those that might be thinking about cover crops or have cover crops in the ground or wondering what to do with that, or, doing some no-till or strip-till practices, especially if it's maybe your first time. We know every year is a little different. It's always nice to get a little handle on the forecast when you try to think about how that might influence what you're doing on your farm. And so I'm just going to go through just kind of a few high level bullets of things to consider. And we don't like to just prescribe because everyone's farm is different. We're coming all across the Corn Belt, all across the region. So everyone's things look a little different for everyone. I peeked outside a bit ago and it's actually raining here in eastern Nebraska, but I think it's barely hit the ground. I think there's like 200s in the rain gauge. So that doesn't really do much for you when it comes to actually soaking into the ground. So, dry weather, I think, is probably the biggest thing on everyone's mind, especially if you're doing cover crops after the spring that we went through this past year was, is there enough moisture out there to plant cover crops, and what kind of cover crops do you plant, and when do you plant them? Certainly, we found out this spring that termination timing is important when it comes to making sure it doesn't use up too much moisture if we're limited. And so dry weather, if that does continue, sounds like maybe for the next couple weeks, it's kind of a prime seeding time for cover crops. If you're planning to broadcast, you're kind of getting up to the end of that window. Maybe we think about holding off and trying to drill some of those cover crops if there isn't any rain out there, just to try to get some good seed to soil contact if there is anything down below. But laying it up on top might delay that for a few weeks, and then that might run into issues as far as germination and getting enough growth before winter hits in. Again, depending on kind of how the weather works for you and harvest timing, but certainly as we think about October, if it does come to be wet and cool, delayed harvest, what does that look like for seeding cover crops? What does that look like for fall activities? That could delay that cover crop planting and that seeding planting. So maybe leaning more towards something that has a little more cold tolerance, and that cover crop, if it's going to be maybe a couple weeks later than what you anticipate, or even a few weeks later than what you anticipate. So something to think about there. Early frost, Will mentioned frost. That's not a good word in Nebraska right now, but even from a weather standpoint, that early frost can sneak up on you, and something that once we get towards the end of the month here can be quite frequent. So that is something we want to consider if you have cover crops growing, right? What does that early termination look like if they're not cold hardy, or how does that change maybe what you want to put in the ground, just knowing that maybe something that doesn't have a lot of cold tolerance might not grow all that well here in the next few weeks. We get that cold and snowy start to the winter. Maybe snowy is a bit of a stretch, but if we do get some blasts of cold air and weather systems, what does that do for that spring growth? So just thinking about, getting what does that might mean for the spring? Do we need to let it grow a little bit longer in the spring to try to get that extra growth that we might not be able to capture in the fall? And certainly if you're thinking fall field work, strip tilling is one of those practices that we work with. Too wet and too dry can be problematic if you're strip tilling in the fall. If you're putting out some fertilizer with that unit, again, if it's too wet, if it does get too wet, after harvest, we're trying to slot some things in. Try not to put it in too wet. That'll smear the sides. Can depend on what type of unit you have, but definitely want to wait for those soil conditions to be somewhat in the middle, not one extreme or the other. You probably won't be very happy with the results. Anytime it's harvest time, we always want to remind folks that how you leave that residue. Again, we talk about residue distribution at the bottom there. We want that distributed evenly, especially when moisture can be up and down. You can get up underneath those windrows next spring if they're not spread out nice and evenly, and you're going to get severe differences in soil moisture from wet to dry, and you won't be very happy with yourself next spring if you don't have good residue distribution this fall. And again, especially in northern areas, the wind never blows in the north, right? But in areas that it does blow, if we can leave those stalks upright, that'll catch some of that loose residue from blowing all over the field. It's another big pain point if you're no-tilling coming to the spring, is when you've got residue that's just kind of blown into windrows, as well as trying to capture some of that snow. If we can add some more snow and more moisture to the ground, especially in years when it's limited, you're already dry, doesn't look like it's going to be incredibly wet over the time period, capturing that moisture is quite important. So I know there's lots of other things, and I've got maybe just a couple more slides here, and then I'll open it up for questions. But just to remind you, we do have a few of the other agronomists on our team that can help answer questions like that, as well as, Will is still on. But if you have other thoughts and concerns or questions, we always like to mention that our agronomy team, we put out articles every month. As ForGround growers, you get these emailed to you every month, and it says, what kind of the happenings, how the upcoming things that you need to be considering when it comes to agronomy. And sustainable regenerative ag practices, all just to try to be timely. And we have some folks on our team that are pretty smart. They're much smarter than I am, that put out some pretty good stuff. So I always encourage you to go there and look at some of that. And then I kind of just, my last slide, just kind of remind you that the things that ForGround, what we're trying to bring to you as growers is, again, kind of the science-based agronomic support is kind of what we have here today. Reduce cost barriers. Matt mentioned this up front, trying to reduce the barrier for folks doing it. And then new revenue streams. We also, know that these things cost money. And so we try to bring you opportunities for that. So again, BayerForGround.com, you can check out all of these things that we have there. So with that is all I want to touch on. I didn't want to get too deep into the weeds or too prescriptive on things there, but really wanted to open it up to see if there are questions. I think Matt might be around to help answer some of the Q&A or anything in the chat. I know if there isn't anything in there yet, they might be thinking about typing in. But I probably have a number of questions for Will, just because the forecast stuff gets it's kind of my wheelhouse. Gets me all excited. It shouldn't, but it does. So Matt, I'll kick it to you. I don't know if there's anything in the. Sorry, go ahead.
No open questions in the Q&A right now. But yeah, Tyler, I am curious. What are some questions you have? Just considering some of the things that Will had brought up there.
Yeah, so Will, just thinking about how dry it is now. One of the biggest things that we get concerned about with cover crops, or one thing we concerned about, right, is I'm using up too much moisture next spring. And I know that that's on the mind of a lot of people right now, because this past spring it did, right? It used up and kind of limited some folks on the amount of moisture. And so I know the winter is hard to recharge soil moisture, just because you typically don't get a ton. But what do you think it looks like for maybe a excess moisture this winter over the next 4 to 6 months, and where that might be, and if that will be enough to recharge the soil moisture to a level that maybe folks might not be as concerned then as they are today?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think ultimately, with through October and into November, I think the spots across Iowa, Minnesota, and the Dakotas, the kind of the eastern part of the Dakotas, I do think that they will overall see an improvement, but my question still is how much we can overcome that deficit. I'd say right now, I think my concern is, while it is going to get more active in those spots, that if it still ends up not being quite enough, my concern is that as we get in through December and January, with the dry risks there, that it wouldn't be doing much of a service there to maintain soil moisture in through the winter months. I do think some areas across the northern plains getting into February and March, they actually do get a little bit more active and actually cooler again. So it's almost a little bit of a kind of a teeter-totter between warm and dry, or warm and dry and cool and wet for us. But the last spring was really interesting in the sense that I know we had a very established snowpack that stayed across the Dakotas, and then we really dried out towards mid to late May and then through June, which was extremely problematic for a lot of the growing area. But fortunately, we did get wet again. But we're kind of seeing the same pattern here, where things have just dried out a lot. It is a substantial hole that we're in right now. I still think my concern is we might still be having some moisture issues come springtime overall. I do think if you're more in the central U.S. or central plains like Nebraska and Kansas, I think those spots are still going to be more favorable to stay more damp, more moist. I think there's going to be enough of a tropical jet influence there that keeps the pattern pretty active. I'd say some higher confidence in those areas there, but I'd say right now across a lot of the ag belt spots, I think there's still going to be some problems in through there.
And then and maybe just to flip it backwards on you, kind of as we head into the next 4 weeks, I think there's going to be a lot of harvesting taking place, right? I think a lot of activity. Things were dry, hot. I think things matured pretty fast. So I'm just, you know, when we talk about you mentioned some of the moisture coming in, the cold air coming in, maybe as it get into October. I mean, at what point is it snow? So I'm thinking more of, when is it going to be cold? Is it going to be cold enough where you're going to get snow in places that shouldn't get snow in early October? Or is it, just where's that line? What's your thought there?
For early October snows, I don't think it's out of the question that we can see some snow here across the Great Lakes, or like the upper portion of the Great Lakes here in the UP of Michigan. In terms of kind of a line of where we can see it, I think probably the northern third of Wisconsin, Michigan, up through the northern portions of Minnesota can expect that. I do think getting into mid and late October that we should be paying attention to opportunities for some earlier snow there, because we certainly had earlier frost and freezes. It's supported there with our past Ninos. But I wouldn't be shocked if, I think towards maybe perhaps the second or third week of October, if we can get a storm system that can bring snow chances as far south as talking around Minneapolis, perhaps in through central Wisconsin, central Michigan, portions of the northern plains. I think North Dakota, it's certainly a possibility through those spots through there.
Just keep it away from Lincoln. That's all I care. Matt, if you have anything else or any other questions or anything, what you found there?
Sure don't. No questions on the Q&A. With that, I think we will wrap, y'all. Give you one last chance here on the Q&A. We don't see anything else come through here. Will, thank you so much for your valuable insight there, and Tyler, you as well. We really appreciate y'all's attendance today. Again, we'll have 4 of these a year, and then when you do become a ForGround by Bayer member, you'll get. We got Jim McGill, any CEUs for today? I don't believe we have any credits open for this webinar here today. Sorry about that, Jim. Yeah, appreciate y'all's attendance. When you do become a ForGround member, you'll get these monthly reports that Will and his team at BAMWX put together, and get that insight sent directly to you via email. So really appreciate y'all attending today. We will send out a post-webinar survey here if you do have a couple minutes just to fill that out as well. That'll help us ensure that these are relevant to y'all in the future, and delivering more information that y'all want to take your time to hear. So really appreciate it, everybody. Randy and the team here at Bayer, thank you for facilitating.
All right. Thanks, Will. Thanks, Matt.